Welcome to the Omen Revelations podcast, where we talk about movies and TV. We talk about comics, comic book characters, and also our experiences writing Omen and Revelation comics.
So today we want to talk about the writing process and what makes comics such a unique medium to work with. Unless you're Frank Miller, Jim Starlin, or Walt Simonson, writing for comics is not a solitary process, and it is not like working in other formats. Because of that, there are many different things to account for when writing comics that you wouldn't for anything else. Do you want to talk about some of those, Mike?
Sure. I mean, there's definitely some major differences. One of the major differences is really because of the medium of comics itself. I mean, in prose, you describe the scene, you convey the emotion, you write the dialogue all with your own words and using as much space and time as you want to describe it because you're the only one working on the pages. That isn't like writing the comics at all. You are far from the only one working on the only pages, unless you're like as Steve said earlier, Frank Miller, Jim Starlin, or Walt Simonson. Um, so this is the main reason why comics are so different when you're writing them. Comics are half visual and half literal. You're telling them through sequential art and through dialogue, onomatopoeia, or phonetic sound descriptions. This affects the writing in three major ways. One would be the scene descriptions, and the actions themselves are depicted by the artist, but still have to be detailed in the panel descriptions that we write. Like for a comic book writer, you're basically having to set the plans for everything. So you're writing parts for the artist, the letter, the whole nine yards. Number two, everything that cannot be said through the art must be written out by the letterer. And because of number three, because of number one and two, a comic book writer can't take all the time and space that they want to explain or say everything. Page real estate becomes very valuable, and the division of who gets said space has to be proportionate. A comic book writer must consider how much space the artist needs to depict what they're describing in each panel, and how much space the letterer can take up over that art in the panel without the words and sound effects hindering the art's ability to tell the story. There are also page limits to consider. In prose, as I mentioned before, you can not only have as many pages as you want, a higher word count is something that an author is often going for. But in comics, you have to consider how to say as much as possible with as little as possible.
True. There are so many moving parts that are involved in writing a good comic book script, things that many first-time comic book writers may not necessarily think about coming in. And I fully admit I had my own learning curve coming into writing comics because there's so much to adjust to as somebody with a background in prose coming in. But before I could talk about writing for comics and how it's different, I want to talk about writing in prose. I recently published, as an example, a fantasy short story in a charity anthology called Perspectives for ASAP Comics UK, and that process was very different from what we do here at Omen. With Blood and Ashes, which was the story that I wrote, it was just me and my editor at ASAP, Jess Mondi, and it was a much looser process to getting the story from page to print. There are much fewer moving parts involved and fewer people to coordinate with to bring your vision to life, and that makes a big, big difference. That can be liberating and it can be more demanding, especially when you've had really good editors like the ones I've worked with both there and here. In prose, everything is down to the writer and the way you tell the story. The page is your canvas, and you're having to draw the story with your language. You don't have the benefit of artwork to carry your story, or lighting effects, or sound effects. You have to provide all of that with the way that you describe things. Nothing exists to cover your mistakes either. If your words don't effectively convey description or character or anything else, that's on you. You get more control over the end result as a prose writer, but you also get more of the responsibility, so there is a trade-off. Fortunately, you're not completely alone. Your editor will help you when writing in prose, and with the story I did, I was very fortunate to have Jess to watch over my blind spots. Jess knew exactly what the story needed to improve, and she went over all the right pieces with a scalpel. I don't think the finished product would be as good as it is if not for Jess. She was an invaluable part of the process. But even with her help, if the story doesn't work, that's on me because I wrote it and my vision guides everything about the story. And also, plotting a story in prose is very different for me as well. With comics, you always have to plan for the space on the page. In prose, I just lay out every point by chapter and give my characters room to run. I can't do that in comics because you have to plan out everything so that it hits the right page count. In prose, I don't care about chapter length as long as there's some consistency between them. But in the end, I wouldn't have it any other way. I love doing what I do for Omen, but sometimes it's nice to have the pure vision in prose. When I do prose stories, I always try to tell the kinds of stories I couldn't and wouldn't do in the Omen verse. I do my best to choose stories that are best depicted in words and that work best with a prose structure. But I admit that every writer's process is a bit different. Mike, what's your experience with prose story been like? Has it been similar for you, or has your process been different at all?
I think you probably had more experience in the prose section than I have. My experience with writing prose is really limited to just a couple of stories. One of which was a fantasy novel called the Mcfear Fantasy, the Mcfear Family Chronicles, which we've actually recently adapted to fit inside the Omenverse.
That's an interesting one, and one I'm definitely looking forward to tackling in the future. I'm sure we definitely have more to say about that once we get there. I'm really looking forward to exploring that a bit more, if I'm honest.
I'm looking forward to that as well. I particularly wanted to see the Guardians interact with the gods and peoples of Ara. That's going to be interesting.
I think it will be, yeah.
Yeah,
It's a great setting for what you've told me.
totally. The other prose story I did is a Christmas story. I'm actually working on now. I think I chose to release it in prose because of the length of the story and our ability to put out comics quickly. I mean, it's a Christmas story that wouldn't really work as well telling it like one issue at a time over several years. It's a story that needs to be digested in a shorter time than that, especially with it being a book about Christmas. I mean, that book really has a few months worth of interest in it each year.
Mm-hmm.
Not a whole lot of people want to read Christmas comics all year round. But while there are things to appreciate in both mediums, and I do like writing both, I definitely prefer writing comics. I think it's because I prefer the medium of comics as a means of storytelling. In other words, for me, the finished product is more enjoyable when it's a comic.
Yeah, I can definitely understand that, and I know what you're saying about Christmas books being time sensitive, so I can appreciate that. I'm actually looking forward to what you're doing with that. Now, for me, I enjoy both formats in different ways, and I'm not sure that I could personally choose. The pure storytelling is attractive, and there's a challenge in telling the story without a net, as it were. As at the same time, I love the way the process of making comics surprises you. There's a joy in getting a cover or new pages that I don't think I can describe for someone who's never made a finished comic. It's basically like Christmas for comic book writers. No matter how detailed you are, though, something takes you by surprise, and I love that.
Oh, that is so true. And actually that's a major difference between the two mediums. When you're writing comics, you get to essentially see your creations come to life on the page. Uh, what at one time only existed within your mind is now fleshed out in detail on the page form. That feeling, as you said, is ineffable. But I think we can agree it is exhilarating. Um, it's exciting in a way you can't get from prose, aside from someone making a TV show or movie about it. I mean, I know with Tosin, he always catches us by surprise with his ever increasing skill. In fact, I'm going to say 99.9% of the time, he improves on the idea that we wrote down on the page.
That is very often the case. An artist can make or break you, and Tozen has made our books what they are for sure. Which leads to one of the important parts of comic scripting, and that's the audience. In prose, you're really just writing for the reader and then maybe the editor. But when writing a comic book script, you are writing for a group of people, but you're especially writing for your artist. The artist is the one who's doing the heavy lifting and telling the story through panel descriptions and so forth. Chris Claremont was well known for writing for his artists, and I try to do the same thing where I can. That means trying to get a sense of who your artist is and what he or she can draw well, what they like. After a while, I notice things when I see Tozen's art coming back. I can tell where he really excels, and I try to play to those things. One thing that I saw in Blitz and Insurrection, for example, is that he can do really good Jack Kirby style layouts. So if I want him to do big superhero action set pieces, I have total confidence that he'll know what I'm asking for and that he'll nail it every time. So in practice, what I'm doing is writing for Tozen to a certain extent, though I'm also keeping in mind the things that Mike needs me to get across for the issue.
I can totally see how trying to play to the strengths of the artist would be beneficial, and maybe I should start doing that. But as it stands, I currently do not. And I think that the reason is twofold. Number one, I focus on the story itself, and the best way to tell as much of the story as I can with the art. I try to foreshadow and also tell backstory in my panels as much as possible, like we talked about with the Alien movies background and the ship's aesthetics. Number two, I have yet to put something in my panel descriptions that Tosin couldn't do well or even improve upon.
That is very true, and that's absolutely a valid approach. I agree with that about how versatile Tozen is and how well he rises up to challenges. He'll always put in 110% to anything you ask him to do, and sometimes more. It really helps to have an artist who can do as much as he does. But what I hope people will keep in mind is that comics are a visual medium. You are telling a story through a sequence of images. That means you should think about what is the best visual impact on each page, and really even each frame. While telling the story in a clear and focused way. You want to think about panels in comics that most struck you and why they had that impact on you. How can you create that magic for someone else in your own unique style?
For me, I try as best as possible to make the reading experience like watching a movie. I kind of look at I'm a big cinephile. And really, I see comics as a bridge between a movie and like a prose book. It really covers that gap. And what I mean by trying to make comics like a movie is that a lot of comics are rather choppy when it comes to the panel to panel action, whereas a movie, if done well, is often smooth. It doesn't jump from one loosely connected scene to the next. You don't have to fill in the blanks with your imagination, kind of an idea. I try to make each panel visually flow and build off the previous panel so that maybe like a second or two passes between each panel. That way, the action scenes in particular seem fluid. I think that is my own unique style.
Agreed about flow, and I have to say I do appreciate the cinematic approach. I mean, it definitely works with something like storyboarding. It works very much the same way, and you're not the first person to necessarily think about it in terms of cinematics, but I like the way that you see it as a bridge, which is a little different. As for me, I try to create a reasonable pace and arrange panels so that they don't look too awkward. Of course, it helps to have Tozen, who's able to make anything you ask for look good on the page. Speaking of which, balance is also important when placing words on the page. With a novel, words are all you have, so it doesn't matter how many words you use. And sometimes more words are even better in prose because you can create a more detailed mental picture during using detailed language. Some writers work in prose and think that more is better, and that's not necessarily wrong in prose. Not so much in comics. That mindset will cost you when creating comics. The story needs to let the art do the work of telling the story. That means you need to include just enough text to get the story across, and sometimes you'll have to trim dialogue and captions so that the art can do the work. That having been said, I'm in agreement with people like Patrick Zurcher, who argues that it's important to have text as well as art. While you want the art to tell the story visually, keep in mind that you are telling a story. That means you do need captions, dialogue, sound effects, and even thought balloons if that's necessary to tell the story. Too little verbiage can make the experience too short and breezy, and it can feel like there's too little going on. So you don't want to err on that side. Yep.
If I could comment on that,
yeah.
I've heard, and I'm curious where you stand on this one. I've heard a lot of discussion about the amount of words that are put on a page. Like, I've actually heard people describe having to read when reading a comic is like a chore.
Yeah.
So like they want almost no words at all, and they want that like you kind like almost like how you're describing. They want the pictures to do all the storytelling.
Hmm.
I personally believe like how Patrick Zurcher you said describes it there, that it is about text as well as art. It's not a one or the other with comics, in my opinion.
I would say that I'm personally in line with what Zurcher said on balance. Now, in terms of audience, you want to think about like, what people individually might want, and they're all going to have different tastes in terms of what they're looking for. Some readers are going to look for, art centric. They want to look at all the pretty pictures and how they connect. They want to see the cinematics, as you pointed out, and that's perfectly fair. Other people want to see more text and they want to have more of a denser reading experience, and they want to kind of challenge themselves in terms of that. And there are writers that definitely are capable of doing that and make a good comic. And Alan Moore is probably the most obvious example. He has very, very dense scripts, but it's definitely a comic. So I can completely understand that. Me personally, in the way I write, I really do try to aim for a balance and a harmony between story and art. I would say I'm probably closer maybe to the Bendis or Dixon level in that respect. I would say that, or at least that I've heard, that a maximum of 52 words per panel is what some pros suggest, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that exact. As you practice this and improve, you'll get a better sense of what works on the page. Where do you stand on that question?
The standard I use was actually, you brought up Alan Moore,
Mhm.
is the one given to Alan Moore by DC's editor when he was writing Swamp Thing, and that is based upon uh, the basis of 210 words per page, and no more than 25 words per balloon or caption or whatever. That number is divided up in between the panels so that it's not exceeded. Those that this works out like this: 35 words per panel if it's a 6 panel page, 42 for a 5 panel page, 52 for a 4, 70 for a 3, and of course 105 for a 2. But as I mentioned before, I also have to consider the page real estate, and I try to keep in mind how much space will be required for each element. Can it be drawn small, or does it need to be? Does it require detail? That really depends on the amount of space needed. Lastly, I consider readability. I know I can't. I think every comic reader has come across those things where the letterer has done the things just too small, you're having to strain to read it. How big or small the letters will have to be. Uh, Definitely affects the readability in the panel. It makes the combination of these two factors, tempered by word limit guidelines, that makes this decision on lettering.
That sounds reasonable to me, and the letterer's role is very, very huge, and sometimes the letterer will make or break you as well. But we've been very fortunate in that respect with Guido. I try not to have too many lines in one frame just to make his job easier. But if I need to say something more, it helps to see if I can add a panel for that moment in time. And I say this because showing time is one of the most unique aspects of comics, and one that you don't have in prose. With prose, you just say that time has passed in the narrative. This amount of time passed and that's it. In comics, a single panel is a unit of time. We show time passing through panel transitions. So imagine that we see a clock in 2 panels in exactly the same shot. If the hands of the clock move between frames, then we see time has passed, and you're showing that visual passage of time by using the space on the page. I'd suggest reading Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud if you want a detailed lesson on how it works, but functionally that's the way it works in comics. You can control the passage of time between frames and by how much. It can be minutes or even hours, but you need to show that visually. You can create the feel of things happening quickly or slowly just by the way you lay out each panel in the script. You can go back and forth through time just by laying out the right images. Look at Christopher Priest's work on Black Panther and Deathstroke if you want to see what I mean by that. You can also use coloring effects for that. I like to use sepia tones for flashbacks and memory callbacks, but you can always find other ways that work for you. Just be aware that there are numerous techniques and tricks to show time visually that you could never get away with in prose.
I definitely agree with that assessment with one amendment. A well-placed caption can be used to show the passage of time as well, like a little later, or even with a digital representation of time. That's something that's difficult to do in prose.
Yeah, that's a useful technique to keep in mind, or sure, for sure. Meanwhile, by the ranch is one of the more common ones, but those kinds of signposts are quite useful in the right places. But really, I want to talk about what should be a prose story versus what should be a comic. Personally, I always try to choose a format depending on what my story goals are. If it's a story that's better told visually or it's a certain genre, it probably should be a comic. Now, I told my perspective story as a short story for a specific reason. I wanted to tell the kind of fantasy short story that they don't do very often anymore. I wanted something in the vein of Michael Moorcock's Elric stories in terms of style and approach. While I certainly could do something like that as a Revelation Comics title in the future, it wouldn't evoke that old school fantasy flavor I'm looking for. Look at Elric the Dreaming City, and you can definitely see a very big difference if you want to see the differences between adaptations. But with Blood and Ashes, it needed to be prose to be the story that it is. That's not to say it can't be a comic one day, but if I do that, it'll become a different thing in adaptation. But with something like Blitz, on the other hand, it adapts very well to comics because I originally intended Blitz as a series of novels, but because it's a superhero series, it works very well as a comic, and it's possible that it works even better that way. When I tried writing Blitz as a novel, there were limitations to doing superheroes in prose that I hadn't noticed before I tried it. You can include a larger cast of characters in comics. You can include subtle Easter eggs, like we do in Blitz #1. And you also can evoke different styles on a visual level. I would suggest thinking about what your story needs most before starting. How do you want your reader to see your story, and what's the best way to get that across? What tools of the craft are most helpful to you, and what will help you get the most out of your story and your characters? Figuring those things out will help you see which is the best format for you. There's no right or wrong answer, just what works best for you and the story that you're telling.
Well said. I think storytelling in general requires a great deal of planning, but I think that's particularly true of writing comics. Preparation is essential to the process. The more you think ahead and set up the road you plan on traversing, the smoother that path is going to be.
Yeah, I would go with that. I think the way you prepare is uniquely tailored to the format as well.
Right. That much is true. But that about covers our conversation on the differences between writing prose and comics. I hope you found this informative or helpful, and if you did, please share it and help us get the word out. I guess until then, we'll see you in 2 weeks.
This has been Steve Sellers and Mike Nunneley with the Omen Revelations podcast, the podcast where we talk about writing, pop culture, and all the influences that lead to your favorite Omenverse and Revelation comics. If you would like to help support us and keep the lights on, there are 2 ways to do that. You can either go to the anchor.fm page, which is anchored at FM/Omen Revelations, and then just hit support, and you can hit any monetary amount you like. Or you can go to Patreon at patreon.com/OmenComics, where you can donate either $4 up to $10 per month if you would like to help us. Thank you very much for your support, and until next time, we'll see you in the Omenverse.